Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is James Crossley. I'm the general manager of Madison Books in Seattle, and I present along with my partners at Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, the Books in Common reading series. Couple things to mention as we start here. We're all very used to Zoom by now, I suppose, but just in case you're not and you're having any trouble with the feed, generally you can just quit out of it and click back into it, and that will restore service and eliminate most of the problems if you have any. Audio problems can usually be resolved by the use of headphones. So if you have some of those, keep them handy or plug them in now. One thing we want to mention about this is a shared creative space that we want to remain safe for everyone. So we will be monitoring the chat and the question and answers, and any offensive comments will be removed, and so will the people who made those comments. Mentioning the chat and the comments, I point out those at the bottom. The little bubble down there that says Q&A is a place where you want to put in questions that you have for our guests tonight, and we'll make sure to share those with them. And you can use the chat along the way. I think that covers the boilerplate stuff. So I will just introduce the fine folks we have with us tonight. First of all, Rob Nyer. Rob was the assistant to the godfather of modern baseball analytics, Bill James, before working for 15 years as a highly influential columnist and blogger for ESPN, and later as a national writer and editor for SB Nation and Fox Sports. Kansas City native, he's lived in the Pacific Northwest for more than 20 years. He's the author of, among other books, Powerball, The Big Book of Baseball Lineups, The Big Book of Baseball Blunders, and The Nyer James Guide to Pitchers. He's currently the commissioner of the West Coast League, a wood bat collegiate summer league, which includes teams in Bend, Portland, Bellingham, Walla Walla, and Wenatchee, and will soon boast franchises in Kamloops and Nanaimo, among other places in Canada. Also with us is Eric Nusbaum, a writer and former editor at Vice. His work has appeared in Sports Illustrated, ESPN The Magazine, The Daily Beast, Deadspin, and the Best American Sports Writing Anthology. Born and raised in Los Angeles, he's also lived and worked in Mexico City, New York, and Seattle. He now lives in Tacoma, Washington, and is the creator of the Sports Stories Project, which for my money is the most interesting chronicle of historical sports esoterica available for free via your email inbox. He's also the author of Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. It's a fascinating account of how sports and cities interact for good and ill. Basically a Latinx version of Chinatown, the movie, I think. And it's the first book I ordered for myself from bookshop.org, the indie bookstore web partner, which is my awkward segue into reminding you that the books these gentlemen have written are available for sale here tonight. In the chat, you'll see a link to places on the web where you can buy them from the stores that have brought you this event. And so we hope you will take advantage of those links and buy and read those books. I will disappear for a bit and let these guys talk, and I'll pop back in later in the evening to share the questions and comments that you guys have. So thanks for listening to me, and take it away, gentlemen.
Well, thanks to everybody for joining. It's a thrill to speak to Eric again. I think Eric and I spoke maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago in another setting, but of course there were a million things I wanted to talk to him about that we didn't get a chance to talk about. Later, of course, I'm going to gush about Eric's book. He's probably sick of it by now, but I'm hoping some people watching this have not heard my gushing yet. They won't be bored by that. But Eric, before we talk about the book, let's talk about the Dodgers, like these Dodgers.
What's going on with these Dodgers?
What is going on? First of all, we're very fortunate that, I mean, this is complete luck, right? That this is an off night during the World Series.
I thought the booksellers wrote to Rob Manfred to make sure that it would overlap.
So I wanted to ask you, I have no idea, you know, I'm old enough that I can't judge age anymore. So I'm just going to have to ask you straight out, how well, if at all, you remember the 1988 World Series?
I don't. I was 2. I remember it because it's one of those things where I've seen the highlights and heard about it so much that it becomes like retroactively a memory.
Right.
The Kirk Gibson home run, the call, the whole thing. It's like chemically implanted in my brain, but I don't remember watching it. I was a toddler. That said,
see, I was hoping you might be in your mid to late 30s, and then you would actually have been, oh, I was 6, and no. Okay, so let me ask you this question. I believe it has, by my count, the Dodgers have been to the postseason 13 times, not including this season, since 1988, and obviously they have not won a World Series in those 13 trips. And I've always wondered what it's like to be the fan of a team that spends immense amounts of money, is almost always the favorite, and yet doesn't win, and literally never wins in your life. You literally cannot remember the Dodgers winning a World Series. So every time, every single season, the season has ended with disappointment.
Yeah, this is funny. It's funny you talk about this because it's been on my mind lately for obvious reasons. I remember in 2004, and in 2004, the Dodgers won their very first playoff game since the '88 World Series. They went 16 years without winning a playoff game, and Jose Lima pitched the miraculous shutout against the Mets in the NLDS that year, and thinking it was the greatest feeling in the world as a fan. Obviously, it wasn't, but it was pretty good. And I've tried in the years since to enjoy those moments, when you have a special game, like, game 1 in this World Series, seeing Clayton Kershaw just like pitch great in the World Series and there being no drama and it just being like a delightful, stress-free performance by an all-time great pitcher. That was really nice. That said, you're kind of, at this point, as a Dodger fan, at least for me, waiting for the other shoe to drop at all times. You're always sort of like thinking, well, it's not going to work out, but I wonder how it's going to not work out this time.
Well, it's interesting because maybe you've thought about this. The Dodger fan of the 1940s and early 50s went through exactly the same sorts of emotions, right? They lost the World Series in 41 after having not been since 1920, I believe. And then
Which they lost also.
Right. But if you're a young Dodger fan in 1941, you think, well, okay, we lost to the Yankees this year, no big deal. But then you lose again, and then again, and again, and again, and always, by the way, to the same damn Yankees team. Now, they didn't have to wait as long as you've had to wait. It was 15 years between 41 when they lost and 56 when they finally beat the Yankees. But I never really thought about this before. But for a franchise that's competitive year in, year out, decade in, decade out, it's obviously, I think when I was really becoming obsessive about baseball history, those 40s, early 50s Dodgers seemed anomalous. But maybe because we have so many rounds of playoffs now, they're not. Teams go for years and years going to the playoffs, but not winning.
The Dodgers are very good at losing in the World Series. They've lost 14 World Series. I think they've lost more World Series than any other team, including the Yankees, who have been to way more World Series than the Dodgers, including the Cardinals, who have won way more World Series than the Dodgers. It's sort of a special skill. I think it's testament to the fact that they've had a lot of really good teams, and a lot of it is luck, right? But those 40s and 50s Dodger teams that struggled and finally broke through, I mean, they had Roy Campanella and Duke Snyder and Gil Hodges and Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese. I mean, they were an incredible team. And the fact that they only won one World Series is partly a testament to the Yankees and partly a testament to just small sample size, maybe. Right. They lost to the Yankees a couple of times in the late 70s. They've just lost a lot of World Series. Maybe it's not anomalous. Maybe it's sort of that they're the sort of stand-in for everybody else, not quite, getting the job done.
Right. Well, you have a similar run with, it's similar in the sense that it's so unlikely. The Twins have lost, 15 or 16 straight postseason games. It's just, when you have all these postseason series, you're going to have some crazy things happen. That's just how the math works. The question I wanted to ask you, and I don't think we touched on this last time you and I spoke. I'm sure you have been asked, and I'm sure you've thought about what it's like to be such a passionate fan of a team that is associated with this terrible thing that you write about in the book. Now, I think we'll talk about this a little later. There's a lot of misconceptions about just how involved the Dodgers were in what happened to the people there, in what we call Chavez Ravine. I'd love you to talk about what a misnomer that is, Chavez Ravine. But I think what I really wanted to get at, this just occurred to me today thinking about it, is that asking you that question about being the fan of this particular team, it almost presupposes that every other team has clean hands, right?
That's exactly what I was going to go with the answer. I don't think any team, any institution really does. We're in a moment right now with American politics and society where we're reckoning with our past. Some of us are. And that requires, taking an uncomfortably long look in the mirror, or really lingering on stuff that you tried to not linger on, and embracing the pain that comes with that process. And as a sports fan, we are often very critical of our favorite teams for making a bad trade, or our favorite players for blowing an easy play, or whatever it might be. And we throw around a lot of invective and let our anger out and all that stuff. But I think, and this is probably my sort of like underlying thesis statement in my version of sports fandom, is that we should also be critical of the institutions themselves, the same way we're critical of the surface level stuff. We should be thinking about why the Red Sox took so long to integrate, or the Yankees for that matter. We should be thinking about what happened to make way for Dodger Stadium in LA in the 50s in a way that goes beyond sort of saying, oh yeah, that happened, and then pretending it didn't.
When I don't know how I first heard about the book. I remember knowing that it was coming last winter, or maybe it would have been last winter, and thinking that sounds like a book for me. And I ordered it from my local independent bookshop, even though I probably could have figured out a way to get one for free from the publisher or you or whomever. But I knew I
tried to send you a free one and you said no.
That might have happened, yeah, because I'd already ordered it. And I can tell you when it arrived because I started it the same day. I write these things down, and when I read a book, it's a weird little freaky little habit that I have. I write down the date I start a book and the date I finish it. And so I know I got the book on the 19th of March because I started it immediately and I finished it a week later. And really, if this was one of those things where if I didn't have a 5-year-old, it would have been 2 days instead of 7 days. I suspect you can relate
deeply
to that, yes. But, and I think I have told you this before, I read the book so quickly and enjoyed it as much as I did because I felt that it was written for me. I don't mean me because of the sort of person that I am, or even that I'm a baseball fan. It's that I have been reading about baseball history in an obsessive way for more than 30 years. And I've reached a point where I really don't need to read another book about what the Dodgers have done on the field. I've read a dozen of them, right? But I do want to read about the Dodgers, and I do want to read about the way sports intersect with our society. And so you essentially wrote a book for me, and that doesn't happen that often. There maybe 2 or 3 times a year I'll read a baseball book that I feel like, oh, this was done just for me to enjoy. So it's such a thrill when you come across a book like that, because it's so rare. So it's a long-winded way of getting around to the question: when did you decide that this is the book that you wanted to write, and why?
I almost hesitate to call it a conscientious decision. I feel like this is going to sound super corny. The book kind of chose me. Not that I was the only person who could write this book. By no means was I. But it's a story that I'll back it up. In the prologue of the book, I talk about this. When I was a high school student in LA, we had a guest speaker in my US history class named Frank Wilkinson. And he was there to talk about being blacklisted as part of the Red Scare in the 1950s. There's Frank.
Here's Frank.
And he was old. I mean, he was in his 90s when he came to visit our class, and he spoke about his career. And he said these words that like echoed in my ears, and they were that Dodger Stadium should not exist. And he set off on his story about why that was the case. You know, he was a public housing advocate and official in LA who had spent his life trying to get these massive housing projects built. And one of those projects was supposed to be where Dodger Stadium now sits. To make it happen, the city of LA evicted more than 1,000 families from 3 communities that were called Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop. But before the actual project could get built, Frank was outed as a communist, which he was, and the project was scrapped. This is a very, very quick summary of what happened in the book. And these families were evicted for no reason. Ultimately, the Dodgers swooped in on the land and built the ballpark, kicking out, not personally, but the city kicking out a few straggling families who were resisting to make way for the Dodgers to build. And that tale just like shook me as a young, earnest baseball fan, as a person. And I don't think I knew yet that I was going to be a writer or a journalist, but I probably had an inkling. And then as I grew into my career as a writer and came to realize that I really wanted to write books, this was the one that I knew I needed to write. I just knew I needed to do it, or at least try to do it. So it was always kind of there. And I think my whole career has been sort of building up to writing it in a certain way.
Well, and I want to mention, I held up this great card of Frank Wilkinson, and there are others that you produced along with the book. Here are a few of them, and there's a 5th. Were there only 5? Do I have all 5 of them?
There's 6. I think you have.
There are 6. I think I missed. Either I'm missing one, either I didn't get one, or I misplaced it. But anyway, there are these 3, and then there's another one I want to talk about a little later, another character. But for me, there are many virtues of the book, but people have written books about what happened to that community, or at least about the process of the Dodgers moving to Los Angeles, which certainly touched on that story and in some detail. But what those books have not done is put the people in the community front and center. And I'm sorry to say that somehow I don't even really know how this happened or when it happened. I guess we could debate that at length. The word empathy became a dirty word in significant parts of our society, which is incredibly demoralizing. Of all the words that shouldn't be a dirty word, empathy you'd think would be very near the top of the list. But it was impossible for me to read your book and not have empathetic feelings for the people in the community, people who I'd never read their stories before. I didn't know their names. I just had this general impression that this thing happened and it was ugly. But it turns out you really can't have any sort of real empathy until you know their actual stories, know that they moved to a place because they were looking for a better life, know that they sent their children off to war to fight for the things that we're all supposedly fighting for when we go to wars. And that really, for me, because I read your book 7 months ago, at this point, my feelings are somewhat impressionistic. 6 months ago, I could have said, I love this chapter and this chapter, and this paragraph was so well written, all true, but what's left 7 months later are sort of these impressions. And the most striking impression for me is that you turned these symbols into actual people who we can't help empathizing with. And I'd love to know it's obvious to me why you did that. You have to tell the story you want to tell. But I think what's really interesting for me as a writer is what your process was in doing that.
Sure. So first of all, thank you. That was extremely kind. I think when I set out to write the book, like once I had gotten past most of the research and reporting and sat down to write, what I really wanted more than anything else was to leave readers with a feeling. I think more than a knowledge of the story, I wanted them to sort of like, it was a vibe I wanted to have lingering in the air somehow around the book, and a sense upon finishing it of the emotional weight of the story. To me, that was the most important thing. That said, it's a factual story, and I'm a reporter, and it's not a novel. So the first part of it was, my sort of MO and preference and sort of values as a journalist are, I like to tell human stories. I'm an empathetic writer. I try to be, at least. I try to be a good listener as a reporter. I try to, capture people's feelings on the page as truly as I can. And I wanted to do that with this book. I think that, even a story about like institutional corruption or something like that has to be human for it to resonate with people. It's the same in fiction. You have to have people and their lives and their actions have to have consequences. And that's kind of how the world works. And that's how stories work for me. So I thought of it that way. I wanted to talk about these people in these communities as fully formed human beings, because I read some of those other books and essays and articles, and there's a lot of value in them, and there's a lot of really good ones, but I felt like the actual humanity was a little bit absent. And I thought that was a place where my, interests as a writer could kind of fit, and I could add something to the conversation. So it was important to me that I got to know these families, and I did my best. Not everybody wanted to talk. I couldn't track everybody down. These were big communities and sprawling families. And, the slice that I focused on, the Archicad family, I think I did it justice. But it was important to show them as people with agency, whose own choices in their lives. This is a family that immigrated from Zacatecas, Mexico, to Arizona to work in copper mining, and from Arizona, when the copper mines collapsed after World War I, to LA, and they did things, and they took charge of their life to the extent that they could, and all the way to the end of the book. I wanted to show them affecting the action of the book, and how their personalities impacted their choices, and how their choices impacted the history of our city, or my city and our country, and baseball.
One of the things that, just skimming through the book today, I was reminded that the original plans for that land included a huge, I think, 10,000 units of housing, government-supported housing, including 1 or 2 13-story towers.
It was going to be like a dozen 13-story towers.
Oh, a dozen. Okay. So I'm sure you're at least somewhat familiar with the history of public housing in the last 50 years. Or 60, and it turns out that that's not a great idea, right? It hasn't worked out that well when it's been done, and I'm wondering if you've thought about what that area would have looked like if those plans hadn't been completely demolished by big business and anti-communists and the newspaper, et cetera, et cetera.
So I think the reason that public housing, has not worked out for the most part over the last 50, 60 years in America is the same reasons that this project didn't even get off the ground. There was never broad enough or deep enough support from the public to fund and sort of manage public housing. The appetite might have been there, but private developers in LA, at least, I can't say I'm a public housing expert. This is the part of the book that I had to do the most research on, because I felt the most insecure about. But they worked really hard to kill public housing, and to kill it. And then when it was not stillborn, but when it was actually born, people have worked hard to choke off funds to public housing. So had that, housing project been built in LA, Legion Park Heights, where Dodger Stadium is now, it might still be there. There's plenty of public housing projects in LA that still are. and it might not. Some have been torn down, and some have been redeveloped, and I don't know. There seems to me that there's a good chance that capitalism would have won out, and that land would have been developed because, it's really, really valuable real estate. It is a great spot, right overlooking the hills of downtown.
So today I was using my Duke Snyder card as a bookmark, and I had again, it's been 7 months, and I looked at the card and I thought, why did Eric decide to give Duke Snyder a card? He really didn't even play all that much, or certainly that well, for the Dodgers when they moved to Los Angeles. Was not really a key Los Angeles Dodgers figure. He was a big star for the Brooklyn Dodgers. So I checked the book, and of course there's a reason why he has a card. He's very illustrative of things that were happening in Los Angeles when he was growing up. So maybe you could talk about why Duke Snyder is actually a character in your book.
Sure. So Duke Snyder, although he is, the Duke of Flatbush, he's not the Duke of Chavez Ravine, was born in LA, and he grew up in Compton, California, at a time when Compton was a redlined, completely all-white town. It's very hard to imagine now, but Compton was a deeply racist suburb that excluded all non-white home ownership. So that's where the Snyder family lived. He grew up there, went to high school with Pete Rozelle, the future NFL commissioner. He was like an all-American boy, superstar football player, baseball player, square jaw, took his girlfriend to the drive-in movies to watch The Pride of the Yankees starring Lou Gehrig, his favorite player, and went off to World War II and came back and became a Brooklyn Dodger. So he had this sort of like perfect suburban LA lifestyle. And I thought that was illustrative of some of the stuff I was talking about in the book with regard to how the city of LA developed. It's a book that's not really about baseball so much. And one of the things it is about is real estate and the development of cities. And, restrictive racist real estate covenants had a huge impact on how LA developed, and a lot of other American cities, probably all. And so I thought Snyder's story was kind of a fascinating way to show it. He used to go to Pasadena and watch Jackie Robinson play football as a kid, because Jackie Robinson was a star athlete in LA at the time too, a few years older. And they became teammates on the Dodgers later on. Snyder eventually has this gets this sour attitude about baseball, and he became a little bit disillusioned. And he spoke openly about playing for money and wanting to go back to Southern California and retire and sort of live in peace. And I thought that was a fascinating thing also, because the way I do talk about baseball in the book is somewhat hoping to puncture some of the mythology around the sport and kind of peel back the reality for players and managers and promoters and owners. And I thought Snyder's frankness about his periods of discontent were really revealing.
You make I love the way you sort of talked about the book just then. When you look at the book, and I think everybody's seen it, but just in case, when I look at the book, it strikes me as very much a baseball book, right? Stealing home, baseball. Kids playing baseball in the street. Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the lives caught in between. There's a lovely blue, which I don't know if that's actually Dodger blue, but it certainly made me think of the Dodgers, right? I would agree with you that it's not your prototypical baseball book. I think you would certainly admit that. I love the marketing because it gives us a little wedge, right? Hey, it's a baseball book. I should read that. Frankly, I might not have read.
I give the credit to Public Affairs and my editor, Ben Adams, for all that.
Yeah, Ben, I've met Ben. They did a fantastic job with the cover, the title, the way everything about it's lovely. I'm having written a few books. I have a special appreciation for books that look and feel good, and this one is right up there.
It's an emotional process figuring out the cover and the title,
Absolutely.
The subtitle. Man, yep. It's like wrapping up your child in its first clothes coming out of the hospital or something. It's never happened to me, but I have friends who have
written books, and it didn't. They didn't wind up looking the way that they wanted them to look, and it never goes away. You're stuck with it forever, right? That kid's not going to grow up. That kid's stuck. But anyway, I'm up to get tangential, but my point is that I would love to hear you speak for a few minutes on the notion that we can somehow keep sports separate from the rest of society. And people like to say sport and politics. I think people use the word politics incorrectly. I think that they should use the words like society and principles. To me, politics is, how do I win this election? It's not, what do I do to people, or how do I treat people? How do we treat people? And I think you've made a practice in not just this book, but you're writing generally of exploring how those things mix, and frankly, how they have to mix. There's no way around it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you almost said it for me. They mix. Sports are a part of society. They're not separate from the rest of everything else. Sports are a reflection of who we are and our values individually and collectively. The way we watch them, the way we play them, the way we market them, everything about them. The Olympics are obviously political. Baseball is the national pastime. I mean, for Christ's sakes, we talk about sports building.
We play the national anthem before every game. How could that?
God Bless America in the 7th inning, or
right.
I think that there's a lot of people who want to escape, and I understand that. You want to not feel anything. You want, especially right now, you want to have just a sense that I am turning off my brain, I'm turning off my soul, I'm just like shutting out the world. And I can appreciate that instinct, because I know we all need that. I need it too. But I also think that instinct cannot be a guiding instinct. It can be a thing that you do sometimes, and then you can say, okay, but then you have to be able to look back and say, all right, I watched that baseball game, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that the taxpayers in Arlington, Texas just paid $1 billion for another stadium that they didn't need. It's a choice of whether you want to live in a way that where you allow these feelings in and allow yourself to be kind of vulnerable to the beauty and pain of the world, or whether you don't. And to me, there's no doubt that I think we should kind of open ourselves up to that and think about it and accept it and challenge ourselves. But not everybody feels that way, obviously.
Well, I mean, you're certainly right. Although I would argue that people who say they don't want the mixture are just uncomfortable with certain mixtures. Because most of the people who say that don't have any issues with playing God Bless America in the 7th inning, right?
Are you saying there's bad faith arguments being made by
maybe
conservative
possible
political commentators, Rob?
Now, I would say, for me personally, it certainly can be refreshing to not have those things mix. It is a relief. And I experienced baseball almost completely through the MLB at Bat app on my phone, and I turn on the game after it started. I mute it if anybody's playing any particular songs I don't care to hear at that moment. So I don't see any flyovers because I'm listening, right? So that's an experience too. But the people who don't want those things, they have choices. They can choose to avoid those experiences. They don't have to read your book.
They don't. But they should, though. They really should.
I absolutely agree with you. They should read it. Let's talk about legacy a little bit. I know that, having read your book and again many others about the Dodgers, and they all touch on this. At least the ones that talk about the Dodgers in the 80s. There is a perception, which I don't know that it's ever been actually tested, that the Dodgers lost a great number of their Mexican American fans. At least that's what we would have called them 10 years ago. I'm not sure what term I should use now, but lost a lot of fans because of what had happened to the community, or what people thought the Dodgers did to that community. And there's sort of the standard storyline is that Fernando Valenzuela brought them back. Now, I don't know if that's actually true, but I am curious about your take on that, on Valenzuela's impact, and also whether the Dodgers as an organization have done anything to grapple with that past.
So I guess I'll take these in order. I'm not sure about the Valenzuela thing. You know, it's the narrative that's out there, and
Right.
I have like Jason Turbo wrote a book called Day Blood Blue about the '81 Dodgers. It came out 2 years ago, and he talks a lot about Valenzuela's impact in exploding interest in the Dodgers, especially among the Latino community, but really amongst everybody, like women who started coming to Dodger games in record numbers during Fernando Mania. And I have no doubt that like interest amongst all demographics, but particularly Spanish-speaking demographic, increased significantly with Fernando. I'm a little bit skeptical that there was this massive like we're not watching the Dodgers because of the violent evictions of the Archicad family movement out there before. There are definitely people in LA who feel that way and felt that way then, still feel that way now generationally. There's people who gave up on the Dodgers because of that, and a not small amount. But I'm not of the belief that those people just all of a sudden saw the amazing Fernando Valenzuela and said, oh, it's okay, water under the bridge, and started going to Dodger games again. I think you're talking about Fernando activating a population of fans who had just been sort of dormant.
Right.
And that's what probably happened. But that's a theory. I mean, I don't know. As for the Dodgers and whether they've dealt with this, the answer is no, they have not. In 2000, under the Fox ownership, former Dodger president named Bob Graziano had an olive branch ceremony, it was called, at a little chapel in Solano Canyon near Dodger Stadium. And he handed an actual olive branch to some of the former residents of the communities. And nothing else has happened since. And it was a pretty small kind of half-assed gesture, in my opinion. The Dodgers were not like a huge part of my writing this book officially now. It's not a contemporary book. I reached out early on. I didn't hear back. I don't think they want to talk about this issue, which is disappointing to me because I think they should and could. And it's a place where they could take ownership of this legacy and affect real change now in the community. And I don't understand why not. I mean, this was, 3 ownership groups ago. It was decades ago. LA is a very different place now. The Dodgers are a very different organization now. There are groups of, residents who would love to get that phone call. There are activist nonprofit groups of descendants who are pushing for it. There's one called Buried Under the Blue who helped me out a lot when I was writing this book. The Dodgers could make a really big impact, and they could bring the story to light and work with the community and open their ears. And I think that would be great.
Well, I mean, I am not a public relations whiz. I always ask these, I guess, what must be terribly naive questions. At least I ask the ether these questions. I don't get a chance to ask actual people these sorts of questions very often, but what do they have to lose? I mean, how is that not a win for everybody? I mean, you look at, first of all, there must be, I don't know, you tell me, dozens or hundreds of people around who at least have some memory of living in the Stone Quarry Hills. And it's not like the Dodgers, in a gesture of reconciliation, say, we're going to rip up these 12 parking lots and build a community center. All they have to do is make an effort, right? I don't know what that would look like. Maybe you have some thoughts, but this does not seem like a difficult thing to accomplish.
I think it would be, first of all, I would say it's not up to me. Like what's the right, remunerance for this? What's the right apology? That's a question that has to be settled between the surviving residents, and there are less and less. Some of the people who I interviewed and whose stories are in this book have passed away since its publication, and even before. There are a lot of things they could do. I think community centers would actually be a great start. Some of the elders have spoken about that, and the Dodgers obviously can afford it. I don't think it's a financial question for them.
Right.
I think it would be great PR. I think it would be more than great PR, the right thing to do.
Right. I was actually sort of shocked when I discovered that the Dodgers had not made any real efforts over the last however many years to address the story, because I don't know, again, I feel like if I worked for the Dodgers, I would be pushing every way I possibly could, because you can't lose. But there are still groups that are pushing for some sort of reconciliation or some ways to address what happened.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there definitely are. I mentioned Buried Under the Blue, and they're an activist political organization. They're a nonprofit, and they are out there, doing tenants' rights stuff, and they're pushing hard. There's a sort of private-public partnership with Loyola Marymount University, where they're taking oral histories. There's a lot of people, the families themselves still gather every summer, this summer accepted for obvious reasons, for a picnic at Elysian Park across the street from Dodger Stadium. This is a community that is easy to find.
Well, one of the things that again, a naive question, but and by the way, I will say, I don't know about you, but I adore Dodger Stadium. It feels like this sort of time machine from the early 1960s, and they've taken such wonderful care of it over the years that I really enjoy going to a game there. But when you're sitting in the stands and you look out toward the hills, and I've always wondered to myself, why did everybody have to leave? There's still land over there. People could be living there. So I guess my question for you is, A, why did everybody have to leave? And B, what actually is there now aside from the parking lots?
So the reason everybody had to leave was because the city of LA in the 50s was really intractable and racist. I mean, ultimately that was the reason. The Dodgers plot of land that they purchased from the city of LA when they moved from Brooklyn, and they really traded for it. They traded Wrigley Field, which is a now paved over stadium in South LA, where the AAA LA Angels played. So they acquired that land. It was 300 acres. And this was the land that had been acquired by the Housing Authority of the city of LA in 1949 to build Elysian Park Heights. So it was all the land. And like to back up, in 1952, when the project was kind of put on hold, they had not evacuated everybody. There were still families who were fighting the evictions. So those families lingered and stayed over these years in which the land's fate would be up for grabs. The housing project wasn't going to get built, but nobody knew what was going to be there. The Archicad family, who I write about in the book, sued for the right to get their land back so they could stay. So they said, well, you're not building a housing project. You really don't need to kick us out. And that fight lasted, till after the Dodgers had already moved to LA. They were evicted in 59. So it was all the land because that was the plot of land that was in the deal. And most of where those communities were it's not even parking lots. A lot of it is just those hills and sort of, reformed earth around Dodger Stadium. The landscape there is not real. The Dodgers moved so much earth and they did so much excavation to build that stadium that it's not even recognizable to what those towns looked like. Mm-hmm. So it's a tragedy, ultimately. Like there was plenty of room. It, everybody knows it. And it just wasn't meant to be, I guess.
And I have to say that the big misconception that I had for a long time was that, and I this is not an easy thing to admit, but I just sort of had always been led to believe, or just assumed because I was an idiot, that it was sort of just a bunch of shanties up there, right? Shacks that didn't have running water, and they were what's the word I'm trying to think of, squatters essentially, which couldn't be farther from the truth, right? There were schools and community centers and churches and businesses, and people spent years and years adding on to their homes. And this was a not only functional, but a thriving neighborhood or neighborhoods.
Yeah, it was a neighborhood. I mean, it was just a part of LA. If you drive around Dodger Stadium now, you go to Solano Canyon, you go up into the hills, the Elysian Hills up there. That's what the houses probably would have looked like now. They just look like old houses. They were houses. It was community. They suffered from the neglect of the city, not wanting to provide them public transportation or not wanting to light up their roads properly. But these were houses with telephones and running water and all the things that you would have expected a 1940s house in LA to have, for the most part.
Right. Well, this was great, Eric. It's I can't believe I've gotten to talk to you twice now about your book.
This has been fun.
Now you've answered almost every question that I've had, but I probably will have more. So we might have to do this again when the paperback comes out. But we will now turn this over for questions to the viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing that. That was fascinating. I love what you guys said about how that this is a sports book, but also not a sports book, because that's the thing that appealed so much about it to me. I mean, yes, it is for sports fans, but it's also the book for people who don't think they're interested in sports. This will make you interested in sports and tell you why it means so much to people. And it touches on an issue that I haven't seen, this whole issue of stadia and how they're constructed and who pays for it and who pays for it by being removed. One of the only other books that touches on this that I know of is Foul Ball by Jim Batten, which I think is out of print now for unfathomable reasons. He describes in it his efforts to acquire a minor league franchise in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and renovate a historic stadium there, when it's the city's interest to demolish it and build a new one on land that they're taking from someone else and so forth. So it's still happening, in this day and age. We do have some questions from the audience here, from the bleachers. One of which comes from Alex asking, what was your biggest challenge, Eric, in the process of writing and publishing Stealing Home?
God, there were so many. The first challenge was finding a way to write it economically, to find a publisher who wanted to tell the story, who believed in it, who thought it was, universal. People would tell me it was too esoteric, it was too LA. Publishing, if you're not aware, is a very New York oriented business, and people there don't really value stories that much that are not clearly resonant to a New York audience. That's my personal take. So that was the first challenge. And the second challenge, the next big challenge, honestly, was getting the trust and building the relationships with the families who had lived in these communities, and really, doing the work I had to do with them and with myself to get to a point where, we were communicating well, and I felt comfortable writing and sharing those stories, which are very sacred to the people who shared them with me.
Now, you lived in Mexico City. You have a background in the Spanish language. Was that essential to this?
It was definitely helpful. I don't know if it was essential. Yeah, it probably was. Everything's essential in retrospect. A lot of the people I spoke with, these are people who lived in the States for 60, 80 years, their whole lives, but also a lot of them spoke Spanish as their first language, and being able to, if they want to switch to Spanish for one phrase or two, and to not lose the thread, when you're in this sort of translanguaging environment, was really helpful.
Another question is, you touched on this. Could you unpack, I guess, what role the Dodgers actually played in this process, and what role the city played, or was it private organizations or the city, or who did what?
Sure. So it's super complicated. I'll start with that. And not everybody really I don't know everything. Is the other kind of mysterious part. The Dodgers bought the land from the city, fair and square, but the city sold the Dodgers sort of. They didn't hold up their end of the deal necessarily. There were still people living there when the Dodgers bought it, and the Dodgers were under the impression that they'd be buying empty land. So the Dodgers sort of bought and inherited this tragedy, this trauma. Like this was a live ball that they were carrying. They very quietly kind of didn't get involved with the evictions when they happened. And I will say that after, the Archicad family's eviction, which is the focus of the book, and it was very dramatic and public and televised, and violent. After that happened, it's my understanding that the Dodgers took a more active role and began to open their wallets and say, we're going to not let this happen again, and we're going to pay some people off to leave quietly.
Interesting. Like I said, like Chinatown.
It's Dodger Town.
Yeah, exactly.
Forget it, Eric.
Which slides into the next question about this. I should say I'm a bookseller, and I'm all about the printed word, but you can't help but imagine casting for a film or a TV show like The Wire, because you have such a range of people that you meet in this book. Executives and grifters and the Archicad family and everyone else. Have you envisioned it that way? Or I guess the question always is, have other people envisioned it this way?
Other people have envisioned it that way. It's not like in development or anything like that, but I've had some conversations with people about it, which is really exciting. And I will say, like, when I was writing the book, I was definitely not thinking about that stuff. I was aggressively trying to not think about anything other than writing the book, like selling the book, the title of the book, like all of it. I was just like, I'm going to finish the book, and anything else will be later. That said, like, I love, Chinatown and noir movies and detective novels, and that, that vibe and that spirit is a big part of the book. And I think in many ways it owes a lot to that genre.
Well, what it reminds me very much of is not a movie, but a miniseries on HBO, which I always forget the name of, but it was had Oscar Isaac, and it was about public housing in, I believe, New Jersey.
Oh yeah, Show Me a Hero.
Show Me a Hero, which I just, that's right up my alley, and this, your story would fit right within that sort of framework for how to tell a story about people down at drilling down deep. So they could do it. If they could do that, they could do this.
Hey, I hope so.
Here's a question that probably both of you can get into, relating to contemporary baseball, back to the Dodgers. We talked about how they've been very successful for a number of years without quite, achieving World Series success. In the past few years, I think they've been perceived as something of a juggernaut. Yet I think nationally speaking, they're a pretty likable juggernaut. Even though, they are now the team that's spending the most and doing all that. But they don't have the kind of, is it just because they haven't won, like, say, the Yankees have historically? What's the reason that they're still not loathed?
Well, they haven't won. I think you hit it.
Really?
I think if they win this year, once they win, people will probably be changing their tune. They do have some really amazing players to watch. Like, how can you argue with Mookie Betts, Cody Bellinger, Corey Seager, the way he's played? Like, I think there's sentimental attachment to Kershaw and wanting to see him get over the hill and win a World Series. I don't know. What do you think, Rob?
I think that number one is that they haven't won. Number two is that, and maybe I'm forgetting someone, I can't think of anybody unlikable on the Dodgers.
A lot of people would say Joe Kelly's unlikable.
I love Joe Kelly.
I like Joe Kelly too, but he's
you're right.
Half of a villain.
But when your most unlikable character is your fifth or sixth relief pitcher, it means you're probably a pretty likable team, right? They're just, but no, the biggest part is that they're not the evil empire because they haven't won. That's right.
And since we are all Northwesterners here, we have to ask about the Mariners. And give us some hope. Give us something to think about. Something positive.
Well, I will just, it's the Mariners do everything well except win baseball games, which is a strange thing to say. Maybe people don't want to hear it, but having spent a lot of time around the Mariners, having been to the ballpark, hundreds of times in the last 25 years since I moved to Seattle. It's always been a really classy organization, and especially with the current group. And it's a mystery to me why they haven't been able to win more games. I think that they need to up their analytical game to keep up. I'm not sure they've done that, although I'm sure they have been working on it. But it's somewhat bizarre that they've not been able to put together a string of 2 or 3 good years in a row in a long, long, long time.
They had a couple of really good teams that just like didn't make the playoffs. Like they won like 95 games with Cano and Cruz and Felix, and you're like, well, like that's just one of those things. You're not going to regret having that good of a team. But I think they're on the upswing. They have a fun young core that's coming up. Like I hope that they sort of continue to like grow together into a Royals or Padres type like team that kind of rebuilds and authentically starts to add on pieces later on and maybe makes the playoffs one day. Who knows? It's not too much to ask for.
Yeah, we'll give the Dodgers this year, and then we'll start rooting for the Mariners again.
Yeah.
One thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, I don't think much, the art. We saw the trading cards, but art is an essential component to your sports stories, emails, and to this book. Can you talk a little bit about that, Eric?
Yeah, and they share an artist too. So the artist is my friend Adam Villison. I started working with him when I was an editor at Vice and commissioning his work there, and we've become friends in the years since, and now creative partners. I would say that one thing that you don't necessarily realize if you don't, try to publish a book is that the author has to usually pay for the photos in the book out of his pocket or her pocket. And so I was in a position where I wanted to include something visual in the book, but I also didn't really want to spend money on photos that somebody could just Google. And I was thinking about it, and the book is a nonfiction book, but I wanted it to read like a novel, to feel like kind of a time and place and have an emotional resonance on the page. And one of the novels that really influenced me and the construction of this book and has influenced me a lot as a writer is the USA trilogy by John Dos Passos. So in my copies, my old paperbacks of USA trilogy, there's these great pencil drawings and kind of pen and ink art. And I thought it would be really cool to have that sensibility. So I asked Adam if he could do some drawings for the book, and he did. And I'm so happy that worked out, because I think they're amazing. And if you subscribe to Sports Stories, you can see them every weekish in your inbox.
You can, and you should subscribe to Sports Stories, because it's really, really enjoyable. One of my favorite things to, the inbox gets too full with everything else, but I always stop and see those.
Oh, thank you.
It's funny you mentioned Dos Passos. I was just thinking of him because I'm reading right now, almost finished with a book that comes out on Tuesday by another Northwestern writer, Jess Walter, called The Cold Millions.
I'm so excited to read that. I haven't picked it up yet. Like, so excited. I love his work.
Yes, very great book. Covers some of that same history, the Wobblies and the labor movement in the Pacific Northwest in the early years of the 20th century. And coincidence of coincidence, we'll be hosting an event with Jess Walter coming up here in a couple of weeks. And we are also hosting another baseball-related writer next week, John Grisham. I think he's thrown out a baseball book or two among all those other things he's done. So
I'm in good company.
Yeah,
one of the things that I miss the most is book signings, because I go to them all the time. I collect signed books, and actually most of the things that I do, I've been able to keep doing throughout all of this, except fly to baseball games and attend baseball games. But book signings, man, I miss them a lot.
Preaching to the choir.
Yep, I'm sure.
We're very glad to be able to do this, though, and keep doing this. And we can still sell you the books, people out there. If it carries any weight for sports fans, I will throw out one piece of trivia. Across the street from where Madison Books now stands is the site of what was the first ball field in Seattle, way back. So we're connected to that. I want to thank you both for being here with us tonight, and I want to thank everyone who tuned in. You can watch this again later on to relive the best moments on our YouTube channel, or you can share it with your friends who didn't get to see it. You can tell them how great it was. You can tell them to watch it and go buy the books, Eric's and Rob's. And join us again next week and in coming weeks as we do more of these. So thanks for now, and good night.